Okay. So what I wanted to mention to you was that for those of you who, and particularly in the face-to-face class, who may not be checking the course website on Blackboard as much as the people who are online, the Core Competency 2 is now accessible. Okay, and it's set up. It's going to work a little bit different than the first one. There's no separate instructions document. There's no turn it in link. It's really kind of set up like a test. It's not a test, but as far as Blackboard is concerned, it's formatted like a test. Okay, so all you need to do is come over here to Core Competency Assessments. Okay, and then just scroll down to the very bottom, and you'll see the link. Core Competency Assessment 2, Social Responsibility, Personal Responsibility, Understand the Democratic and Republican Party Platforms. And if you click on this, I'm going to not go all the way into this, but you'll notice that in the instructions, I've provided some information to you. It's sort of organized by steps. In order to complete this assessment, follow these steps. Okay, so the first step is to familiarize yourself with the concepts of personal responsibility and social responsibility as we're using them. Okay? That concept of social responsibility in particular, its meaning and what we're supposed to understand that to mean, it just kind of depends on who's talking about it. Okay, so I've provided you with a fairly precise working definition, so to speak, of social responsibility and personal responsibility, as well as the idea of accepting personal responsibility and accepting social responsibility. So read over that. And then steps 2 and 3 take you to the platform of the Texas Democratic Party and the Texas Republican Party, respectively. Okay? And you're going to read through these documents, and you're going to find positions in each party's platform relevant to personal responsibility and relevant to social responsibility. Okay, so not only does this assessment give you, some basis for thinking about social responsibility and personal responsibility, but also you'll come away from this assessment with a better understanding of what Democrats are all about and what Republicans are all about, at least Texas Democrats and Texas Republicans. Okay, so when you are actually to the point of writing your answers, you'll see a text box like there's. I think there's. You click on this begin button, and you'll actually see the questions. I think there are 5. Okay, and you'll just type your answers into those text boxes, or you can compose them in a word processing program if you want and copy and paste. That's actually not a bad practice, right?
Blackboard doesn't
Well, you can take advantage of the word format, the word processing formatting tools like spell check and grammar check and so on. So yeah, just copy it and paste it in here if that's the way you want to operate. Okay?
I can never get this.
All right. So the way that I've set this up, I think some of you may choose to do this all in one sitting, but I think it's more likely that most of you will probably do it in parts, right? So I've set this up in a way that I think should allow you to get into it and get out of it and get back into it, but I'm not absolutely sure because I've never done this before, okay? I've never done it this way before, okay? So if you run into any kind of difficulty, like let's say you start working on the assignment and you decide you have to go take care of a kid, or you have to run to the grocery store, or you have to take a day off, or come back to it in a week, or what, you have until April the 17th, by the way. But anyway, so you say you're going to break your work into several different increments. If you run into any problem getting back in, I need to know as soon as possible so I can, figure out why. But I'm optimistic that it's going to work the way that it's set up. Okay? So keep in mind you have until 11:59 p.m. on Saturday, April the 17th to finish this up. How many sessions you use to do it is up to you, but that's the deadline. Okay? All right. Questions about that? Okay, so this week, let me do this before I forget. So online, Amin and Rian, can you see a slide that says the Texas legislature? Okay, good, thank you. All right, so the topic for this week is the Texas legislature, and I want to talk a little bit. So, I don't know if you've noticed this. We're now in week 8, so if you haven't noticed it, maybe it's time for me to point it out. Okay. On any of these topics that we have on the syllabus, okay, there's a lot that we could cover. This may have been something that came up in a class session previously. Like we could have an entire 16-week course just on political parties, like we dealt with last week. We're trying to cram a discussion of political parties, particularly in Texas, into 1 week, and we could have an entire 16-week semester. If you look at the catalog for most universities, University of Houston, University of Texas, Texas State University, Sam Houston State University, whatever, you open it up to the political science department course offerings, you're going to see entire 16-week courses devoted just to the specific topics. Legislatures, right? Either the Texas legislature or the United States Congress, or maybe it's a combination. You might see an entire 16-week course just on political parties and interest groups or something like that, right? So in other words, what I'm saying is we're trying to cram a lot of stuff in. We have to be very selective in terms of what we cover. And I try to do it with some sort of theme underlying it. And so, as I said, if you hadn't noticed that up till this point of the semester, maybe it's time for me to just go ahead and point that out. So the theme that we're going to be talking about with this topic on the Texas legislature is limitations on the people's branch of government. It's not my term referring to the legislature as the people's branch of government. This is something that has sort of been the traditional American way of thinking about legislative bodies since our origins, since the founding of the republic back in after independence, right? So when historically, when Americans have referred to the people's branch of government, they've been talking about the legislative body, whether we're talking about the national legislature, the United States Congress, or whether we're talking about in any of the 50 states, the state legislature, right? We've sort of moved a good deal away from that over the last 100 years. Almost 100 years, particularly at the national level, where people tend to identify more closely in some ways with the president than with Congress anymore. But, there was a time in our history, American history, where people really did kind of identify more closely with the Congress than they did with the presidency. But anyway, that issue aside, the people's branch of government. And when I say limiting the people's branch of government, what I'm suggesting to you is that there are certain features of the system in Texas that really make it difficult for the state legislature to be responsive to popular will, okay, to majority will, okay? So I want to begin with some treatment of constitutional considerations, the first of which we really focused on in our discussion of the Texas Constitution. The week that we were dealing with the Texas Constitution, we talked a lot about the length of the Texas Constitution and the fact that the Texas Constitution deals with specific policy issues. Remember when we were talking about the comparison and the contrast between the U.S. Constitution and the Texas Constitution? We said that the U.S. Constitution is really sort of a general framework for government, and that's why it's so much shorter. It just sets up the institutions of government, and it sort of assumes that particularly the legislature is going to make policy decisions. But the Texas Constitution really comes from a different starting point. It is a document of detailed provisions, remember? It is a document that specifies policy authority, and oftentimes, in order for the legislature to be able to act, to undertake authority, if it doesn't already exist in the Constitution, it has to be put in by constitutional amendment. And that's why, a big part of the explanation why we have somewhere over 500 amendments to the Texas Constitution. All that ring a bell?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that long ago, right? Where we were talking about. And you just did You just did a
Yeah,
core
but the whole-
competency.
Yeah,
on it.
the whole thing of it, like trying to figure out like all the propositions and everything that they go with. Like, I don't know, there was just so many that I was looking through when we were doing the essay.
Mhm.
I don't know.
Yeah, it is real easy in an assignment like that to get swamped by the detail.
Yeah.
But what I really want you to think about right now is kind of the general implication of that. What it really does is impose that process of policymaking by constitutional amendment really imposes a limitation on the legislature. It's as if from the very beginning, when was the beginning when we talk about the Texas Constitution? 1876, okay? Through really today, Texans sort of have this idea that the last thing you want to do is turn the legislature loose.
Yeah.
The people's branch of government, the last thing you want to do is take the straitjacket off of them.
Yeah.
What you have to do is you have to keep putting more and more restrictions on the legislature in the form of policy authority. Okay? All right, so we're familiar with this first one. We don't have to say a whole lot more about that, okay, unless you have questions. What we really didn't get a chance to talk about in our discussion of the Constitution, because again, we have to be selective about what we talk about, is some of these other limitations imposed by the Texas Constitution on the legislature. Not the least of which, maybe the most obvious of which, is the limit on sessional time. You may recall that the Texas legislature meets in biennial sessions. What does that mean? No, that would be biannual. There's a difference. See how the difference that one letter can make, or one or two letters can make? Biannual versus biennial, right? Biennial means once every 2 years, right? So in odd-numbered years, we're currently in a non-odd-numbered year, 2021. So the legislature is in session over in Austin. Am I pointing towards Austin? Yeah, I think I'm kind of pointing towards Austin. The legislature is in session over in Austin, okay? And it will remain in session for a fixed period of time. I don't know what date it started on, sometime in January, and we're now into almost mid-March, okay? So we got 2.5 more months of the Texas legislature. There's 140 calendar days, not 140 legislative days. And I want you to understand what this means, that by the Constitution, the Texas legislature must adjourn at the end of that 140-day session. It's not like they can say, oh, well, we're not finished with this legislative matter. Let's just stick around and finish it up. The Constitution requires that the legislature adjourn. And they can't then go right back into immediate session. There is a provision allowing the governor to call a special session of the legislature, but historically governors have been pretty reluctant to do that. We have had in recent years, going back maybe about the last quarter century or so, increasing number of special sessions of the legislature, but that's probably just testament to the fact that the 140-day regular session is insufficient. The fact that we get governors in recent years calling more and more special sessions probably should tell us that, well, maybe that 140 days just isn't enough time for the legislature to do its work.
Yeah.
Now, what many analysts would say, people who, I'm not one of them who really is a student of Texas government, okay? I know enough, I guess, about Texas government, but I'm not like my former professor, Burl Pettis, or some of the others who made their careers on studying the Texas political system. My former professor, Burl Pettis, would wonder aloud whether there was some sort of, orchestrated motivation behind keeping this at 140 days. In other words, whereas 140 days, by the way, this is the one provision of the Texas Constitution that hasn't changed since the Constitution was adopted in 1875, since it went into effect in 1876. In other words, the Texas legislature in 2021 will meet for 140 days, just as the Texas legislature did back in the 1870s.
This is a lot we got to talk about now.
A consistent 140 days?
A consistent calendar days, right? Not legislative days. If they're not doing legislative business on a holiday or on the weekend or something like that, that's just lost time. Okay? So,
Holiday breaks.
so, you know, we are operating in 2021. You know, you might think to yourself, well, maybe 140 days was sufficient back in the 1870s. Texas was a very different place. Texas, you know, most Texans lived on the farm, earned their living by working the soil or on the ranch or whatever. The Texas economy was agricultural based. Today, the Texas economy is post-industrial. It's high tech, right? Most Texans live in urban areas, metropolitan areas, and the kinds of problems that confront the state of Texas, and therefore, as a matter of fact, the state legislature, are very different in 2021 than they were back in the 1870s. But we are still operating as much more complex, much more complicated, bigger, grander, et cetera. But we're still operating as if 140 days is sufficient in 2021 as we thought it was back in 1875. Yeah.
What would you talk about? Like for example, like what would you need 100 and and I know that sounds like it feels like it's a big number in my head.
140 days?
Sorry, no.
Well, consider that the United States Congress, the national legislature, meets in open-ended sessions, in annual sessions every year. And those annual sessions, and when I say open-ended, you see, the Texas legislature is a closed-end session. In other words, we know that it ends in 140 days.
Yeah.
For the United States Congress and many state legislatures, they're open-ended. So they meet starting in January, and the United States Congress conducts its business, and they have the authority under the U.S. Constitution to adjourn themselves, but that in the modern Congress really just doesn't happen until the end of the calendar year. They're pretty much in session all the way. Do you remember, for example, try to get a real high-profile example here for you to understand. Do you remember, for example, in December of 2019, when the United States Congress was still in session, considering the first impeachment of Donald Trump?
Yeah.
Okay?
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
That's just a high-profile example.
Yeah.
Most of the time, they're in session
It took them
all the way through December dealing with legislative issues. But anyway, that sort of drives home the point. The Congress is still in session for the most part in December, right? And then the new session begins in January. But the Texas legislature is once every 2 years and only for 140 days. Yeah, Miles?
I think in defense of closed session, it gives them kind of a timetable. They know that if they want to get something passed, they have to with this time. They can't make unimaginably unnecessary lengthy laws that take like half the time to say and get things.
Well, maybe. I'll say this in response to what you said, and we can develop this further when we get to that point. The counter to that is that it requires, this limit on sessional time requires that somebody take control and shepherd the process. Somebody has to sort of be in control of the calendar. Somebody has to sort of make things happen. Whereas if there was less control, you might have the kind of scenario that you're talking about where, you know, you couldn't get much of anything done because you would be considering everything, right? In other words, as part of the theme that we're getting at here, limitations on the people's branch of government. There's a limitation to what the Texas legislature can consider, and one of the big reasons for that is that there's just not enough time to do it. Notice the question out to the side. How much the critics are arguing, or at least asking us to consider, my old professor Bill Pettis, how much democracy can actually take place in 140 days? The skeptics, the cynics, say is really just not feasible to have think about everything that democracy implies. Full consideration of a wide range of alternatives, full debate, right? Full representation of a broad range of interests in the political process. How much of that is likely to happen when you have this looming deadline and a budget that you have to pass, which, by the way, in Texas is for 2 years. It's not like, at the national level or in many other states where you budget from year to year. Imagine you as an individual trying to budget for 2 years. At the beginning, you know how much money you have, and you're going to try to make that over a 2-year period. All the contingencies that you can't anticipate. Nobody anticipated in January of 2019. Nobody in the Texas legislature anticipated COVID-19. There's nothing in the budget of the state of Texas as a contingency for COVID-19. Right? Even what?
The freeze.
The freeze, yeah. Nobody anticipated that. At least not since 2011 when we had our previous one. Yes, sir.
When I did the core competency assignment, I noticed that it would show you the for, why, and then the against. The against, they had some good points. They weren't just wild, emotional thoughts. They were really just, is it going to raise taxes? That's why we don't want it. Or how is this going to give us more money? Yeah, how is
You're talking about you looked at some sort of voter's guide?
Huh?
You're talking about you were looking at some sort of voter's?
No, when we did the core competency
Yeah,
assignment,
yeah.
When you looked at all the amendments.
You're talking about the analysis that,
Yes.
yeah,
When
on
I
the
looked at
website, yeah.
The for and the against,
Yeah.
like, there are some good points.
I just want to know that sometimes, in national government, and federal government, they just make laws that are unnecessarily long sometimes. Like, recently, one guy asked that this law be read out loud, and it took 11 hours. The 3 other congressmen that were deciding to listen to it, I think, fell asleep within the first hour. And they didn't listen to the rest of it because it was that long.
I don't know whether the implication of what you're saying can be empirically verified. I mean, it could be empirically verified. I don't know if anybody ever's done it. In other words, do you understand what I'm saying? Like, if you were to do a comparison of acts of Congress and the word count, just something simple like the word count of acts of Congress, and compare them to the average word count of an act of the Texas legislature, you may be right. I'm not disputing that you're incorrect. I'm saying I don't know. Is the average word count of an act of the state legislature of Texas really statistically significantly shorter than the word count of an act of Congress? I don't think it has so much to do with the number of words that are in a statute. It just really has to do with how much debate. What you're talking about sort of dragging things out, really has more to do, I think, what you're getting at really has more to do with how much time there is allotted for debate. Because you do have a filibuster in the Texas Senate, but that's kind of a different issue. But so I'm not sure. I mean, and then there's another possible response to that is, well, if you think, we kind of hinted a moment ago that Texas is a very different place in 2021 than it was in 1875, and the problems are much more complex, and the problems are much more pressing, so to speak. The scope of the problems are bigger, et cetera. It may be that you could make an argument that, well, as complicated and as broad in scope as things might be in Texas, it's even broader and more complicated at the national level. So maybe that accounts for some of the issues that you're talking about with, how overly complicated legislating seems to be at the national level in Congress. I mean, there's a lot of things to sort of factor in there. But I would be interested to know if anybody ever does a study, I would be interested, I would read it, right? Comparing those kinds of considerations with respect to acts of the Texas state legislature versus acts of Congress. I mean, it's one thing to just assert that because your intuition tells you that that's what's going on, but it's another thing to empirically verify that that's actually what's going on. And as I say, you may be right. It may actually turn out that you're right about that. I just don't know. Okay. All right. Here's another feature, which, the Texas legislature is like virtually every other legislature in the United States in this regard. The United States Congress and 49 of the 50 state legislatures are bicameral. There's only one state that doesn't have a bicameral legislature. So we can make a big deal about this one in isolation you would say, well, that doesn't sound like, so what? It's like that everywhere, right? It's only really, though, when you couple this with the previous one about sessional time that it exacerbates the legislative process, because you've got this fixed 140-day session that you've got to get a bill through the legislative process in 2 chambers rather than just 1. Okay? And I'm going to let you pick up the details from the chapter in the textbook on the differences between the House and the Senate, Texas House of Representatives and the Texas Senate. But the one thing that I mentioned here, just these numbers indicate the number of members in each chamber. 150 members in the Texas House, 31 members in the Texas Senate. Okay? So again, I'm including this here in our discussion just as it relates to, it's a problem for legislating in Texas. Again, with all that implies full consideration, full debate, a wide range of issues being represented, et cetera. It's problematic in Texas when coupled with that limit on sessional time. Okay, here's another principle of the Texas Constitution that we find in other American constitutions as well, including the U.S. Constitution. The principle of separation of powers. And as I'm sure you understand, that means that there are these 3 branches of government, the legislative branch, executive branch, and the judicial branch. And why 3 different branches of government? Well, because there are 3 different functions, 3 different basic functions. There's a legislative function. What does that mean? Power to make the laws, right? The executive function is the power to execute or carry out the laws, and the judicial function is the power to adjudicate the law, right? What? Well, we have a lot of courts in Texas. In a couple of weeks, we'll deal with the court system in Texas, and you'll see just how many courts we have in Texas. But at the top, you have actually 2 Supreme Courts in Texas.
Really?
Yeah, you have the Texas Supreme Court and the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. Texas is one of only 2 states that has, in effect, 2 state Supreme Courts. But we'll get to that when we get to the topic on the Texas courts, okay? But yeah, you have this sort of hierarchical structure in the Texas court system, right? So separation of powers means that you have these 3 branches of government, and the reason that you have these 3 branches of government is because it's good. See, this is a normative concept in the American mind. It's good that each of the 3 different functions of government ought to be exercised by 3 separate branches of government. That's as fundamental to the American concept of good government as you get. It's not the preeminent model of democracy in the world. The American system of separation of powers is really not the predominant model. The parliamentary model is really the predominant model. And in parliamentary systems, you don't have nearly that functional separation as you do in the American system. Right? So again, for example, I don't want to digress on these points too much, but just to hammer that point home, illustrate this point. In most parliamentary systems, for example, the administration, what we call the administration in the United States, or what they typically, like in the UK, call the government. They use the term the government. We would say the administration. The Biden administration or the Trump administration, they would say over there the Johnson government. Right? Boris Johnson is the prime minister of Great Britain. The Johnson government, or the Thatcher government, or the whoever the prime minister is at the time, right? So that's just a difference in terminology. But my point is that the prime minister is the rough equivalent of what position in the American system? The president, right? But would it surprise you to learn, maybe you already know, that the prime minister in most parliamentary systems is also a member of parliament? The president is not a member of Congress. In fact, the Constitution expressly prohibits that. You can't be both president. You can't be, more generally, you can't be both an executive and a legislator at the same time. That's why when, U.S. senators or members of the House of Representatives get appointed to a president's cabinet, they have to resign their seat in Congress because you can't, separation of powers prevents that. Those branches of government have to be separate. Okay, so again, I don't want to digress too much on that. I'm really just trying to drive home that point that the American system is unique when we take the world picture into view. Okay? I shouldn't use the word unique because it's certainly not the only system that has that functional separation of powers, but it is the most glaringly conspicuous in the United States. Okay? So Texas is part of that. That's why I said that here's another constitutional principle that we find in the Texas Constitution, just like we find in all other American constitutions. But as you might expect, there's a little bit of a twist to it when we talk about the Texas Constitution. There's just a feature of it here that works it a little bit differently, makes it work a little bit differently in Texas. And it's in this, it lies in the fact that the Texas Constitution has an explicit statement of separation of powers. If I gave you an assignment to go out and find your favorite internet source and link to, Google, I guess, is for most people, search engine, I meant to say, right? Go out to your favorite search engine and Google U.S. Constitution and, read the U.S. Constitution. Don't worry, I'm not going to give that assignment. But if I did, you would not see the word separation of powers anywhere in that document. The word separation, and it's not because they didn't know those words, separation of powers, that Madison and the other framers of the U.S. Constitution did not know the word separation of powers. They did. They're in the Federalist Papers, and they had read The Spirit of the Laws by Montesquieu, the French philosopher Montesquieu. They understood separation of powers, but they created a system of separation of powers without ever using the word separation of powers. And I think that's even more than interesting. It is instructive to understand that they managed to do that. The Texas Constitution has a specific statement of separation of powers. It's Article 2 of the Texas Constitution, and ironically, one of the shortest articles. Okay? And it says, you know what, I should have it linked up because it's short enough here that I could show you, but it says that there shall be 3 separate branches of government to which are assigned the legislative powers to one, the executive powers to another, and the judicial powers to a third. All right? However the exact wording goes there, but that's basically it. But then there's one little clause that follows that says, and no power vested in one branch of government shall be exercised by another branch of government unless expressly provided in this Constitution. That's the theory of non-delegation of authority, which means that the Texas legislature can't delegate any sort of decision-making authority to the executive branch, unlike the model under the U.S. Constitution. Again, I don't want to digress too much on these points, but let me suggest this to you. Let's do it by way of example. It's easier to do it by way of example. So let me think of a good one here. Okay, how about it? In 1970, Congress, the United States Congress, passed a law that was popularly known as the Job Safety and Health Act. And in that legislation, Congress ordained that every person holding a job in the United States of America has a right to be reasonably free of occupational safety and health risks. That just because you hold a job, and you have to hold a job in order to feed your family and put a roof over their head and all that sort of clothe them and so on, doesn't mean that you should be exposed to unreasonable health and safety risks while on the job. It's called the Job Safety and Health Act. Now, the 535 members of the United States Congress could not possibly identify all of the potential threats to worker safety and health in all of the workplaces across this broad land. Think about all the varied, not only how many, but how different the workplaces are. all right? How could the United States Congress possibly ever identify all of the threats? So it created this agency called OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And it empowered OSHA to make decisions not only about what constitutes a threat to worker safety and health, but also what the remedy, what the solution is to that threat. Okay? It's called formal rulemaking authority. And OSHA is certainly not the only agency, executive branch agency of the federal government that has that formal rulemaking authority. EPA has it, Environmental Protection Agency, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has it, Food and Drug Administration has that kind of authority. There's I don't know, several dozen agencies of the federal government that have quasi means sort of quasi legislative authority. But the point I'm really trying to get to here is that when OSHA makes a rule governing workplace safety and health, or when the EPA makes a rule governing air quality standards or water quality standards or something like that, it has the effect of law just as if Congress had made the law itself. Now, under separation of powers doctrine, what branch of government makes the laws? The legislature. Congress is supposed to make the laws. But here you have executive branch agencies that are making law. Okay? And the courts, the federal courts, have consistently upheld the authority of executive branch agencies to do that. They have essentially said it's not a violent, or it's not a serious violation of separation of powers. That you still, because if Congress, I think the reasoning of the courts is essentially, I hope I don't oversimplify, but I think the reason is something as simple as this. If Congress can delegate the authority to an executive branch agency, in other words, if it can give it, it can also take it. So if OSHA gets too out of control, if OSHA goes overboard and makes a lot of rules that people just don't think that OSHA should make it, that Congress doesn't think OSHA should be making, they can always reel them in, right? By curbing that rulemaking authority. So the courts have said, it's not an egregious violation of separation of powers. Okay, now, that's the model at the federal level. And we might be tempted to take that model that says Congress delegates authority to an executive agency and just superimpose that on Texas. The Texas legislature passes a law and it delegates authority to an executive branch agency, except you have this little provision of the Texas Constitution here that says that the legislature can't do that unless there's a specific provision in the Constitution allowing it. Let me give you an example. Again, examples always help, I think, right? In 1990, the support for having a lottery in Texas built to the point where the legislature proposed an amendment to voters. Okay? Now, why didn't the legislature just pass a law creating the Texas lottery? Well, because that authority is not in the Constitution. Okay? So the voters are called out to the polls to give it's not really that average voters really think about it this way, but what it really is technically is that the voters are saying, okay, there's nothing currently in the Texas Constitution that empowers the legislature to do this, but we're going to put that into the Constitution now to give the legislature the authority to do that. Follow me? Okay? So part of that was that you have to have some sort of agency of state government, let's call it, say, the Texas Lottery Commission, that is empowered to make rules and decisions about how to run the lottery. Because the legislature over in Austin, the House and the Senate are not going to get into that nitty-gritty, right? Mm-hmm. But they can't just create this agency called the Texas Lottery Commission. You have to have voter approval to do that. Well, once they get that, now they can delegate authority to the Texas Lottery Commission. That's except in instances herein granted. All right? Okay, so that's really the big implication of this provision of the Texas Constitution, this theory of it seems so innocuous. Like I said, it's really the shortest provision of the Texas Constitution. It seems so harmless. It seems so, it's just some words, right? But it's been one of the impediments to allowing the legislature to actually legislate. You have to put that authority into the Texas Constitution. Okay? Questions about that? All right. I think this is the last one on the list for constitutional considerations. It is. All right, so I should have asked you before I put it up there to guess how much Texas legislators make.
Yeah.
Well, when I've asked that question of classes in the past, they will say something like, $100,000. But they're probably thinking about Congress, members of Congress. I don't even know what the salary is for a member of Congress now, but it's probably at least $100,000 a year. Okay? But in Texas, the annual salary for members of the legislature is $7,200.
How many legislators can be?
There's 150 members of the House and 31 members of the Senate.
Let's discuss. Can you have a regular job while you do it? Yeah.
Well,
I hope.
okay, look, let's say you work for Lowe's Home Improvement Center.
Yeah.
Do you think that the management of Lowe's is going to give you 140 days off to go be a legislator in Austin?
No, I didn't even think about that.
So who is able to serve in the Texas legislature?
Retired people, military.
Well, retired people, maybe not. I mean, not just.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, maybe people who have their own law practices and can turn it over to the lawyer, to their partner, to run while they're in Austin, be elected, or who have their own businesses and they can hire people to come in and run their businesses, right?
That's where the lobbying comes from.
It really limits who can serve, right? $7,200 is the kind of financial sacrifice that I certainly couldn't make, even if I had a desire to be in the Texas legislature, which I don't. But who among us can really make that sacrifice? Only the most financially well-off people can probably, as a general rule, afford to serve in the Texas legislature. Yeah.
So generally, it's either you have to have your own business, you have to be individually wealthy, maybe retired, or someone else is funding you.
Some other means of support.
Because also you also have to have the money to maintain.
Yeah. Some other means of support, because you aren't going to be able to support yourself maintaining a residence in Austin and in wherever you're from around the state, Panola County or Jim Webb County or someplace, El Paso County or something. You're not going to be able to maintain two residences on $7,200 a year. Now, there is a provision of the Texas Constitution that provides a per diem, okay, a stipend per day. The authors of your textbook have the exact amount. Okay, I've forgotten exactly what it is, but when you do the arithmetic, I think it comes out to about $11,000 for the first year, because there's that per diem while the legislature's in session, whatever that is times 140, whatever that per diem is times 140. But trust me, you can eat that in Austin in one day, just going out to, lunch and breakfast and lunch and dinner, right? Which legislators do, right?
Yeah, like, I don't know why they even bother paying them that much.
You don't know why what?
Well, like, why do they even bother paying them at that point? I mean, it's still a huge loss.
Again, I can tell you what some of the arguments are, and then you can sort of decide whether you find them credible. Okay, so the main argument in favor of keeping the legislative salary low is something like this: the last thing we want is a professional legislature. Okay, the last thing we want is professional politicians going to Austin because they're motivated by the salary. Okay? We get that in Congress, they'll say. Although members of Congress probably also really don't need their salary. Most of them are well off before that, right? So that's a whole other thing, though, right? Let's stay on track with this argument. So the argument is, what we want is a citizen legislator. We want people who want to serve in the legislature because they want to do the public's business and they are not trying to line their pockets by doing it. But at least up until this point, there have been very few restrictions. The salary aside, there have been very few restrictions on payments that legislators can take from other sources.
Wow.
There's the famous story of Bo Pilgrim. You guys know who Bo Pilgrim is? Pilgrim's Fried Chicken.
Yes,
Yeah.
from
Going to the Texas legislature and passing out whatever it was, $10,000 checks or whatever, to just legislators, whoever, came by, he would give, the check.
Was it real check?
Real money, yes, in the form of a check, yeah.
He gave him $10,000 check.
I don't know if that was the amount. I just picked that amount arbitrarily. It was some noticeable amount of money. Because the reason I say a noticeable amount, you can do a Google search, if you were curious to find out the exact amount. But the reason I say a noticeable amount of money is because it became controversial. People noticed. He's in the open. He's not doing it hiding, behind closed doors. He's just passing out checks.
Yeah.
And that was just a single, one episode. But again, I use it to sort of drive home the point that for much of Texas history, there really haven't been a whole lot of restrictions on the money that members of the legislature can take from other sources. Maybe speaking engagements or something like that, they might be able to expect to, get a stipend for that from whatever group wants to bring them in to do some sort of speech. But the $7,200 is the argument again in favor of it is that it promotes the concept of a citizen legislator. And now the critics are going to say that it means only certain people can serve, right? And some might even argue that there's something to be said for being a professional politician. That our sort of instincts are to recoil at the idea of a professional politician, but somebody who's been in politics for a long time, who kind of knows how the process works, the decision-making process works. What you have historically ended up getting a lot in the Texas legislature are a bunch of novices, right? The turnover has been historically pretty high in the Texas legislature. People don't serve for extended, unlike the United States Congress, where people can be elected, or in some state legislatures where they can be elected and reelected and reelected, they might end up there being there 20, 30 years or something like that. Most members of the Texas legislature only serve 1 or 2 terms. And it takes some time, the critics argue, it takes some time to build up some expertise, to build up some understanding of how state agencies work and how state governance works. And you lose that without having professional politicians, they would say. And when you lose that, that means that the people who are there, the novices, you know what I mean by a novice, right? Okay? The novice politicians who are there, have only been there 1 term or 2 terms, tend to become very reliant either on staff or, in many cases, lobby groups for information. And so they can't really develop that independent source of knowledge and expertise in that short period of time. Okay, questions about any of that? Okay, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I at least want to show you where we're going with the rest of this. These are the constitutional limitations. There are others, but I think these kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about here. Again, just to put it in the broader context of the discussion, what we're saying is that these are some restrictions imposed on the legislature by the state's constitution that really make it very difficult for the legislature to act as the people's branch of government. All right, well, now we want to talk about some political aspects of the Texas legislature that in some ways are the consequence of, or at least in part, the consequence of the constitutional restrictions, okay? So, the the first thing that I have listed, this is going to be a shorter list. Okay, it's only got 2 items on it. Okay, so the first thing here says no party legislature. The Texas legislature, historically, we may be in a period where we're seeing some change now, but historically, the Texas legislature has been a no party legislature. Now, when I say that the Texas legislature has historically been a no-party legislature, I do not mean to suggest to you that you don't have Democrats and you don't have Republicans in the Texas legislature. You do, and you have had, okay? But the party caucuses in the Texas legislature have, as I say, up until now, maybe very recently, we've seen some changes, but the party caucuses have been dysfunctional. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit of detail, probably on Thursday. But for now, what I'm trying to say is that because you have dysfunctional party caucuses in the Texas legislature, that means that a power vacuum is created. And the kinds of functions that are carried out in a legislative body, traditionally by party caucuses, still have to be performed. They just are performed in some other way. So this power vacuum that's created with dysfunctional party caucuses has led to a concentration of authority in the leadership, the presiding officers. Has anyone read the chapter for this week yet? I know that it's a reasonable thing for you to wait to do the reading for this week until at least after you've taken the reading quiz or the reading assignment from last week. So I know when I asked that question, has anybody read the chapter on the Texas legislature yet? The chances are pretty low that you've done that because you've got something else in the queue in front of it, right? Which is the reading quiz for Thursday, all right? Well, when you read the chapter in the textbook, see if you do not come away with a sense that the presiding officers of the Texas legislature are among not just the most powerful politicians in Texas, but maybe in the entire country. Now, who are the presiding officers? The Speaker of the House of Representatives and the Lieutenant Governor in the Senate. They exercise, historically in Texas, have exercised significant authority. And it's largely the result of this power vacuum that's created. It's not because speakers and lieutenant governors are particularly power grabbing or dictatorial. It's just that there has been no other basis for unity and cohesion in the Texas legislature and the legislative process, particularly given the short 140-day session. Remember I said earlier that it may mean that someone has to take control and shepherd the process? That's been the role of the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor. So very little gets through the Texas legislature, for example, that doesn't have the stamp of approval of the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker of the House.
Now, does it create a problem?
That's why, anybody happen to know who the Lieutenant Governor is currently? His name is Dan Patrick. Dan Patrick has a lot to say about what gets through the Texas legislature over there. We've got a new speaker this term. We'll see how the authority of the speaker plays out in this term but previously Joe Strauss, and before him, I forgot who it was before him, but going a long line of speakers who've been very, very important. Yeah.
So do you say their authority is probably only second to that of the governor?
Well, again, historically, jump a little bit ahead here because the executive branch is for the week after spring break, but the Texas governor is, at least formally, speaking, in terms of formal authority, on a spectrum of strong executives to weak executives? No, it's at the bottom.
Oh my God.
Traditionally, the Texas governor has been considered a weak executive. Now, there are some caveats to that, and we'll get to that after spring break, but that's a reflection, the weak governor in Texas is a reflection of the suspicious minds of the framers of the 1875 Texas Constitution. Remember, that Constitution was written after Reconstruction, and it was a reaction to what they perceived as the abuses of the governor's authority under E.J. Davis. And they were trying to create a constitution that would prevent that sort of concentration of authority in the hands of a future governor. And so they really diluted the authority of the governor in a lot of ways. But the bottom line for us now is simply that historically, the Texas governor has been pretty weak. Now, it's still the governor, and so the governor gets a lot, it's kind of a highly visible figure. And as I said, there's some caveats. There's some informal mechanisms that may allow a governor, who knows, maybe Greg Abbott would be an example of a governor, or Rick Perry might be an example of a governor that is able to use some of these informal bases of authority to enhance gubernatorial leadership. So we can get into all of that. But in direct response to that question, for a good chunk of Texas history, the real power brokers in Texas politics did not aspire to the office of the governor. For example, Bob Bullock never wanted to be governor of Texas. He wanted to be lieutenant governor. Bill Hobby. Have you ever heard the name Bill Hobby? Bill Hobby, his portrait used to be downstairs in the lobby of this building. Apparently he was pretty instrumental in getting this campus up and running. But when he was lieutenant governor during the 1980s, he never aspired to the office of the governor. He hoped that the governor wouldn't retire or die, I suppose, so that he could stay in the real position of power, which was the lieutenant governor's office. So, yeah, very, very influential presiding officers, Speaker of the House and Lieutenant Governor. Okay? Now, in the little bit of time that we have left, I want to back up here and talk a little bit about this concept of a no-party legislature. And let me see, let me do it this way. What do I mean when I say that the party caucuses in the Texas legislature are dysfunctional? Actually, maybe we do need to look at this first, okay? So, what are we talking about when we talk about a political party? We've thrown around political party a lot over the last 2 weeks, and we haven't really established what a political party actually consists of. So here's a simple little model that suggests, it's something that's commonly presented in textbooks, of what a political party consists of. The three components of a political party are the party organization. It doesn't really matter the way that I've drawn this here. You can put any one of these three on any one of these three vertices. Okay, it doesn't really matter whether party in the electorate is on top and party in government is over here and party in the organizations over here. You can switch it up, but this is just the way that I draw it, okay? But the idea here is the party in the electorate is really the loosest component of the party. It is the most passive, the more passive element of the party. It really just means all the voters out there that identify with the party and vote for the party's candidates in the elections. So all the people out there who say that they're Republicans, or all the people who say that they're Democrats. That's the party in the electorate. Some more strongly identify with the party, some less strongly. okay? So they're like the consumers of, selecting the candidates that they like the best. It's like buying toothpaste, I suppose, right? Over here, you have the party in government. The party in government refers to all of those elected office holders, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the members of the Texas House of Representatives, the members of the Texas Senate, the county judges, the county commissioners, all the way down, right? Or if we want to take the national party, the president and the members of Congress, right? That's the party in the government. All the elected office holders under that party's label. Okay? And then over here you have the party organization. And the party organization, the authors of your textbook do, I think, a really pretty good job of talking about party organization. So I'm going to keep it pretty simple here. This consists of like the executive committee members of the party officers, not elected to a government office, but elected to a party office by the rank and file membership of the party. So like the state party chair, the state committee members, right? The county chairs, the precinct chairs, that's the party organization. Now, the question is, what is the relationship among these three? Well, I've already suggested to you that the party of the electorate is the passive component, like the consumers buying or not buying what these have to offer. So that leads us to, well, what's the connection between the party organization and the party and government? What is it, which component of the party is really sort of driving the train, so to speak? Now, in many political systems, like parliamentary systems that I mentioned earlier, we would find that the party organization really is driving the train, right? And the people who serve in the government really serve at the pleasure of the party organization, so to speak, right? But in the United States, and that includes Texas, it sort of works the other way. That the party organization is really it's a little more than just sort of a service organization, catering to the party and government, running primaries, for example, okay, maybe some get out the vote campaigns, that sort of thing. But it's really these people here, this component of the party, that determines the agenda and the direction of the party. So that's the part we got to focus on, the party and government, okay? And specifically, what part of government are we talking about this week? The legislature, right? So what is the role of the party and government with respect to the Texas legislature? Well, I think the easiest way to sort of get at that is to do a comparison contrast sort of thing. So we're just about out of time, but when we come back, in fact, 8 seconds, when we come back on Thursday, we're going to start by talking about 3 different models of party strength. The parliamentary model is the strong party model, the United States Congress is the weak party model, and the Texas legislature is the no party model. Okay, so that's where we'll pick up on Thursday.
First day of